Hey, you. You're finally awake.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. As you know, the NES had many games. Over 1,000 in fact. And there are so many that I've never played, and there are so many I haven't even heard of. So today I'm going to be looking at 7 games that I've got no clue what they're like and never heard them in my life. Now some of you could have heard of these games, I very well think you have, so don't come at me and go, well I know this game, it's really good. I don't. So let me know in the comments if you've played these games, and the question of the day, which ones are really good, and which ones should I be looking at in the future? If you do like this content, please give it a like and also subscribe for more content, and if you listen to it on your mobile, give it a hype because it really helps with small content creators like me. If you want to hear more of me, Retro Wars is a weekly podcast where this week we're looking at Professor Layton and the Curious Village for the Nintendo DS. And we've also got our $1 a month Patreon where you can help my family get our own little house, you can join in the podcast and get your own show called DLC. Right, let's get into it, shall we? 7 unknown NES games. 3D World Runner. Okay, I have to be honest, this one I actually do know and have played, and haven't finished it, but I've played it, because I did it for the podcast. But even before then, it was still unknown, I'd never heard of it, because you can look back at the library of the Nintendo Entertainment System, and you often think Square, because they made the Final Fantasy series. However, did you know that they made this game, the 3D Battles of the World Runner? No, you probably don't know, although it's usually shortened down to 3D World Runner, released for the NES in 1987. Now, at simple glance, it looks like a simple arcade action style, but it holds an interesting place in history thanks to its unique perspective, its use of 3D technology. The premise of 3D World Runner is pretty straightforward. You play as Jack, nicknamed the World Runner. A hero must run through 8 different alien worlds infested by serpentine creatures known as the Serpent Beasts. The narrative is pretty light, as many games were of the era, but establishes enough of the sci-fi setting to justify the gameplay. Each world is broken into several stages, ending in a boss fight against a massive dragon-like creature. In many ways, the game borrows its structure from arcade titles rather than sprawling NES adventures. But what made 3D World Runner stand out was its visual style. Instead of being a side-scroll like Super Mario Bros. Or a top-down game like Zelda, 3D World Runner used a forward-scrolling perspective. The action takes place as the camera is right behind Jack, showing him running directly into the screen. This type of perspective is heavily inspired by Sega's hit arcade game Space Harrier, which used similar into-the-screen gameplay with enemies rushing towards the player. The NES wasn't capable of matching Sega's arcade hardware, however, but Square still managed to create a convincing pseudo-3D effect with scrolling backgrounds, scaling sprites, and fast movements. Added to the uniqueness was the game's 3D gimmick. Now, the original release of 3D World Runner came with a pair of red and cyan 3D glasses. God, you remember those when we were kids. And the players could actually make it a 3D mode by pressing the select button. Now, I've not played this version, so I've got to go with it and go, okay, yeah, because I played it on a PC. But this made objects in the game appear to pop out the screen, and at least in theory, again, you can confirm me if that's the case. The effect wasn't perfect, and the technology was primitive compared to modern 3D visuals, but at the time it was a novel experiment. And not many NES games attempted this, making 3D World Runner one of the most unusual entries in the library. Gameplay is deceptively simple, but also challenging. The player controls Jack as he's running forward, but you must avoid obstacles such as pits, walls, and enemy projectiles by moving left and right or jumping. The jumping mechanic is central to the game, as you often have to leap over wide gaps between platforms. Timing makes these jumps frustrating, since the perspective makes it difficult to judge your distances accurately, but also part of the game's learning curve. Jack can also fire projectiles to defeat enemies, but the combat takes a backseat here to the reflex-based running and jumping. The boss fights against the Serpent Beasts bring a slight change of pace. These large, dragon-like enemies swoop across the screen, and the player must dodge their attacks whilst firing back. They're visually impressive for the NES with long segmented bodies that move quite fluidly. However, the battles do feel a bit repetitive because it's kind of the same boss when you get to the end. It's like, okay, I faced this one, but this one's a bit bigger. Reception of 3D World Runner at the time was mixed. Some players are wowed by the forward-scrolling perspective and the 3D glasses feature, while critics go, yeah, it's not that fun, and you may as well play Space Harrier, so I can kind of understand that. But it's still put in history because it's one of Square's early projects before Final Fantasy put the company on the map. For NES owners in the late 1980s, it was a unique experience like anything else in the system. And although it may not be remembered as a classic, it remains a fascinating snapshot of a company finding its footing and experimenting with bold ideas in game design. Dragon Spirit. When it comes to shoot-em-ups on the NES system, most players immediately think of games like Gradius or Life Force, but there was another title that gave players a very different kind of shump experience, Dragon Spirit: The New Legend. Released in North America in 1990, this game was based on Namco's 1987 arcade title, Dragon Spirit, but the NES version went beyond a straight port. Instead, it featured a heavily modified design with new story elements and altered gameplay, making an unusual case of a console adaptation taking creative liberties with its source material. Now at its core, Dragon Spirit is a vertical scrolling shoot 'em up, but instead of piloting a spaceship, the player controls a dragon. And that sets it apart from its peers immediately and makes me think, get in, because I'm not a fan of these shmup games, but give me a dragon, yes I'm in. The story casts player as a mole, a warrior who transforms into a blue dragon to defeat an evil serpent demon named Swowl and rescue the Princess Alicia. I'm already in. I want to play this game now. I do have the ability to play it and I probably will. However, the NES version, the story is reimagined into what Namco called the New Legend. Here, the narrative begins with a mole defeating Swowl, Zawel, in the past, which leads to peace across the land. The player now takes control of Amel's son, named Huey, that's a stupid name, who becomes a dragon himself to face a new threat, the evil Golda and his army of monsters. This shift in storyline also came with 2 different game paths, which was rare for NES shooters. If the player survives the opening sequence of the game, Huey will turn into the dragon and players get to experience the hard version of the game, which is more faithful to the arcade original. But if the player falls and dies early on, a cutscene shows Huey's sister being captured as he transforms into a golden dragon instead. This leads to an easy version of the game with fewer stages and lower difficulty level, probably the one I'll end up doing. It was an innovative way to offer accessibility for players at different skill levels like me, while also tying the mechanic to the game's story. From a gameplay perspective, Dragon Spirit follows traditions of the arcade shoot 'em up with its own flair. The dragon has 2 types of attacks, fireballs for enemies in the air and bombs to drop on enemies on the ground. This dual targeting system is similar to Namco's Xevious, and it requires players to pay attention to both enemy types simultaneously. Now as the game progresses, power-ups enhance the dragon's abilities, including wider fire breath, stronger bombs, and even additional dragon heads, allowing the player to shoot multiple streams of fire at once. That just sounds so cool. These upgrades create a satisfying sense of growth, but losing a life strips them away, adding tension to the gameplay. Visually, the game's ambitious. The dragon sprite is large and detailed, and each stage features distinct environments, from volcanic landscapes and icy caverns to sky temples and monster lairs. The bosses are equally imaginative, ranging from giant insects and sea creatures to mythological beasts, not just long dragons what we had in the last game. While the graphics are understandably scaled down from the arcade, the NES port still does a good job capturing the fantasy atmosphere. The challenge level is another aspect worth noting. This game is hard, especially in the harder path. Enemies swarm from all directions and make stages require memorization to survive. The dragon's large hitbox makes dodging even trickier because he's so bloody large, a common criticism among players. Still, the presence of the easier Dragon Golden route gave new players a chance to see more of the game without immediately getting overwhelmed, which was a thoughtful addition for the NES audience. Take note, Battletoads. Reception of the game was mixed but positive. Some players praised its fantasy setting and a unique twist on the shoot 'em up formula, others felt the difficulty spikes were unfair. It never reached the same legendary status as Gradius or 1943, but developed a following among fans for challenging NES shooters. Importantly, it stood out in a crowded genre because it gave the players a chance to control a dragon rather than yet another spaceship. Exactly! In retrospect, Dragon Spirit the New Legend is a fascinating example of how console ports could diverge from their arcade counterparts. And to be fair, they could have just done the arcade port and made it an NES game, but no, they decided to make it a different version with new storyline, branching paths and adjusted difficulty, which I think back then is pretty cool for them to do so. It might not be the most famous shmup on the system, but it remains a distinctive and memorable part of the NES library, especially for fans who appreciate the mix of high difficulty, imaginative design, and inventive storytelling. Tombs and Treasures. When you think of the NES games, usually you're thinking of like these action, fast-paced platformers or the classic shooters or an RPG. But one of the most unusual titles was Tombs and Treasures, a game that really didn't fit neatly into one category. Released in North America in 1991 by Infocom and developed by Neon Falcom, this title blended elements of adventure games, RPG mechanics and puzzle solving in a unique experience that stood apart from most of the NES library. So basically it was a bit of a hodgepodge. It was like, just throw that in there, that in there, and we'll see what comes out. The story of Tombs and Treasures immediately sets the tone for a mysterious and cerebral adventure. You play as a young hero who, along with his girlfriend and a professor, set out to uncover the secrets of the ancient Mayan city of the Chichen Itza. I wouldn't bother, because I'd imagine I'd probably die. The plot centers around the disappearance of an archaeologist and search for a hidden treasure guarded by powerful foes. The game's setting was unusual for its time. While most NES games were taking place in fantasy lands, space, or colourful cartoon worlds, Tombs and Treasures grounded itself in real-world history and archaeology. This gave the game a unique identity, as well as a certain sense of atmosphere that few other NES games could actually match. The gameplay is divided into 2 parts. When exploring the ruins, the game shifts into a first-person perspective, reminiscent of early computer adventure games. You can look around rooms, examine objects, and use items in a creative way to solve puzzles. This gave the game a slower, more methodical pace compared to action-oriented designs in most NES games, but either way, it's better than Mario is Missing. Many puzzles required logical thinking, such as using specific tools to unlock doors, combining objects to progress, or deciphering clues hidden within the ruins. At times, this felt less than an NES game, more than a PC adventure game. The second part involved combat. When enemies appeared, the game shifted to a traditional RPG-style battle system, with turn-based attacks and stats determining the outcome. You can control your character, his girlfriend, and occasionally the professor, each with their own abilities. But battles weren't the main primary focus of the game, they just added an extra layer of tension and variety to the otherwise puzzle-driven experience. Again, this is just throwing everything in there. One of the most striking elements of this game is its atmosphere. The graphics are quite simple for NES standards, but it did an effective job portraying the ancient ruins, eerie temples, and mysterious artifacts. Each area actually had their own distinct look, and that helps because when you go into so many different temples, you don't want it to all look the bloody same. But what made it stand out was its problem solving. Unlike most NES games, where progress depended on mastering reflex-based challenges, this game demanded careful exploration, note-taking, and experimentation. For players used to action games, this is going to be a bit of a shock because they're used to fast-paced games, but this is a slower-paced, intellectual gameplay, and that's quite refreshing. It was one of the few NES games where you really had to think your way forward, rather rely on just quick button pressing. Reception, however, was mixed. Some players praised its originality and unique blend of genres, while others criticised its slow pace and lack of action compared to popular NES titles. Again, they weren't expecting what this game was going to be, because they were expecting fast-paced games like Mario, and this is very slow. It didn't really achieve widespread popularity, probably due to its niche appeal, and its release late in the NES lifespan, where players were already moving on towards the Super Nintendo. However, there is still a dedicated fan base, and maybe I should give this one a look. It's remembered today as one of the most unusual NES titles, and one pushed the system in the territory normal reserved for PCs, and while it might not be as well known as big titles like Mario and Zelda, its mix of archaeology, puzzles, exploration, and RPG combat makes it a bit of a hidden gem for those who are willing to try something different. For those who enjoy NES games that break the mold, Tombs and Treasures remains a fascinating curiosity in the system's library. Battle of Olympus. Now, during the NES era, there were a handful of action games that stood out, combining platforming, exploration, and RPG elements. Legend of Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, anyone? But another title followed closely in its footsteps, The Battle of Olympus. Released in North America in 1989 by Borderbund and developed by Infinity, this game is often remembered as a Zelda-like adventure infused with Greek mythology. Though it didn't receive the same level of fame as Nintendo's classics, it carved out its own identity and became a memorable hidden gem on the NES library. Now, the story of the game draws heavily from ancient Greek myths. You play as Link, Orpheus, a young hero on a quest to rescue his beloved Helene, who has been kidnapped and taken to the underworld by Hades, ruler of the dead. Along the way, Orpheus must travel across a vast landscape inspired by real locations from Greek legend: Athens, Sparta, Arcadia, and Crete. Each area has its own enemies, secrets, and connections to the gods, and by aiding the gods of Olympus, Orpheus can learn special weapons and abilities that will help him overcome the dangers ahead. Gameplay-wise, Battle of Olympus is a side-scrolling action game. Basically, it's Zelda 2. Let's not sugarcoat this, it's Zelda 2. Players must talk to villagers, gather items, and backtrack to previously visited area once new abilities are unlocked. Progression is non-linear, with certain areas blocked off until you earn the right tools or gifts from the gods. Oh, it's a Metroidvania. This structure encouraged careful exploration and gave the game a sense of depth that many NES action titles lacked. Combat is simple but requires precision. Orpheus begins with only a basic wooden club, it's a bit harsh, but over the course of the game he gains stronger weapons such as sword and shield, as well as mythological items such as the Harp of Apollo or the Sandals of Hermes, which allow him to jump higher and reach new areas. Why don't you let him be Zeus and just start lightning bolting bastards? Each new power doesn't just make combat easier, it opens up fresh possibilities for exploration, again Metroidvania. This design gave Battle of Olympus a satisfying sense of progression that kept players invested. The enemies' designs are also based from Greek mythology. You can fight Cyclops, Gorgons, Harpies based on my wife. She's never going to hear this. I'm fine, I'm safe. We're completely safe, don't worry, no one grasped to her. Boss battles are also particularly memorable, with creatures like the Hydra and Cerberus blocking your path. These encounters tested both your reflexes and ability to use the right weapons or strategies, making them highlights of the journey. Visually, the game did make good use of the NES hardware. Environments were varied and atmospheric, ranging from lush forests and bustling towns to dark caves and fiery underworld settings. While the Battle of Olympus earned its praise for its ambition, it was also criticised for its difficulty. When have we heard that been described about NES games? Like many NES games, it demanded precision platforming and careful combat timing with punishing enemies and limited health. Some players found the lack of guidance frustrating, as it wasn't always clear where to go next. Oh, that sounds like Castlevania 2. Still, for those willing to stick with it, the game offered a rewarding and immersive experience that rivaled many bigger name titles. In terms of legacy, the Battle of Olympus never reached the same height as Zelda 2, it was never going to do that, but it remains a cult favourite. Fans of Greek mythology appreciated its faithful incorporation of legendary figures and creatures, while retro enthusiasts continue to view it as one of the NES's most ambitious action-adventure titles. It may not have been a blockbuster, but its blend of mythological storytelling, exploration, and challenging gameplay gave it a unique identity that still holds up today in the NES catalogue. Demon Head. Among the many quirky titles on the NES, few are as strange, ambitious, and downright eccentric as Clash's Demon Head, often just called Demon Head. Released in North America in 1990 by Vic Tokai, this game blended platforming, action, exploration, and an offbeat sense of humour into something that was hard to classify. Now at a glance, it looks like a standard side-scrolling action game, but beneath the surface lies an open-ended structure, a sprawling map, and a storyline as often bizarre with most of its contemporaries. It's a game that confused some players back in the day, but for others it just became a cult classic. The story sets the tone immediately with its over-the-top premise. Players take on the role of Billy Big Bang Blitz, a secret agent who's called back from vacation to save the world. With a name like Billy Blitz, of course it's going to happen. A doomsday device has been activated and it's up to Billy to stop it before the time runs out. What starts as simple action hero setup quickly turns into a chaotic anything-goes adventure. Along the way, you'll meet demons, talking animals, secret cults, alien beings, and even philosophical musings about good and evil. Wow, this really sounds a bit deep for an NES game. The narrative constantly throws curveballs at the player, giving Clash of Demon Head a distinct personality that set it apart from others. The game's structure is one of the most ambitious aspects. Rather than simply from moving stage to stage, like 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, Clash of Demon Head presents players with a massive overworld map composed with over 40 interconnected routes. No, I'm screwed, you can't do that to me, my little head would explode. Each route is a side-scrolling stage, but you can choose which paths to take, backtrack and explore in a non-linear fashion. The design was years ahead of its time, resembled what we call a Metroidvania, really? Where exploration and revisiting areas with new abilities are central to progression? Okay, fair enough. For NES players who are used to linear platformers, this freedom is both refreshing and daunting. Gameplay mixes traditional run-and-gun action with light RPG elements. Billy can move, jump, and fire his weapon like in many NES action games, but he also gains access to shops where he can purchase items, equipment, and upgrades. Power-ups include jetpacks, magic spells, underwater breathing gear, and enhanced weapons, all of which expand the ways you can tackle different areas of the map. This gave the game a real sense of progression. By collecting money and investing in new gear, you could open up strategies and explore previously inaccessible routes. Enemies and bosses also reflect the game's eccentricity. You'll face demons, ninjas, mechs, and bizarre creatures, each requiring different approaches. Some bosses are straightforward fights, while others involve odd scenarios or dialogue sequences that feel closer to an RPG. What really makes the game stand out is how unpredictable the encounters are, as you never really quite know if you're about to fight a monster, meet a new ally, or stumble onto a completely bizarre cutscene. Visually, the game was colourful and varied, with environments ranging from forests to underwater caves and volcanic regions. The sprite work was solid, giving Billy and his enemies expressive animations. This non-linear structure, while innovative, often left players confused about where to go next. Yeah, I was 4 at this time, I would have been crying and pooping my pants. Key items were sometimes hidden in obscure locations, and without a guide or lots of trial and error, progress could really stall. The difficulty could also spike suddenly, with tough enemies and long stretches between checkpoints. These frustrations kept Clash of Demon Head from wider success, but for persistent players, the payoff was surprisingly deep and memorable adventure. Reception, as you can expect, was pretty mixed. Some players praised that over-the-top design and wacky storyline, but others just found it too convoluted and unforgiving. But over the years, it seems to be doing quite well. Its non-linear map structure was ahead of its time, and its bizarre narrative gave it a unique charm compared to other straightforward titles. Modern gamers who enjoy Metroidvania-style design often look back at it as kinda like one of the grandfathers. In hindsight, it remains one of the NES's boldest experiments. It tries to merge platforming, exploration RPG elements, and a sprawling storyline into one game, and while it wasn't really perfect, it did succeed in creating something that feels distinctive today. For NES fans who just want to embrace something that's a bit quirky and a bit strange, maybe this is the game for you. Werewolf: The Last Warrior. In the late 80s and early 90s, the NES was packed with action platformers, but one of the most unusual protagonists came in Werewolf: The Last Warrior, a side-scrolling action game released in North America in 1990 by Data East. Instead of donning a sword or blasting aliens with a laser gun, players stepped into the role of a man cursed, or perhaps blessed, who could transform into a ferocious werewolf to battle evil. While the concept was bold and promising, the execution sadly left the game with a reputation for being frustratingly difficult and uneven, even though it's got a strange atmosphere and striking imagery that has given it a small cult following. The story of Werewolf: The Last Warrior plays into the comic book style melodrama. The game is set on a post-apocalyptic Earth overrun by an evil organisation called the Biocorporation, led by the villainous Dr. Farian. That was a mouthful to say. Swear to God the amount of takes I had to do to get that right. This group is bent on world domination, and their experiments have unleashed mutants and monstrosities upon the land. The player controls a man named Ken, one of the few survivors who could stand up to this new menace. No, not Ken Masters. It could be Ken Masters though, we don't know. We have no idea. Ken Masters could have gone from street fighting to a bum to a scientist, and now he's a werewolf. Either way, it's Ken. After gaining mystical powers, Ken has the ability to transform into a werewolf, giving him the strength to take on Biocorporation's mutants and save humanity. Gameplay is that of a standard side-scrolling platformer at the first glance, but the werewolf transformation mechanic sets it apart. Ken starts off as a human fighter with limited attacks, mostly punches and kicks. However, by collecting red W icons, he can transform into the werewolf, which drastically changes his abilities. In this werewolf form, Ken gains stronger attacks, greater reach, and the ability to climb walls, opening up new ways to explore stages and fight enemies. This duality between weak human form and powerful werewolf was the central gimmick, and it added strategy to otherwise straightforward action. However, the transformation system also came with a risk. If Ken collected blue icons, he would transform into a super werewolf, an even stronger form. Did you rip this off Sonic? Although he probably came first. Even if he took too much damage while transformed, he would revert back to his human self, leaving him vulnerable. This back and forth created a push and pull dynamic that forced players to manage power-ups carefully while avoiding taking hits. It was an interesting mechanic, don't get me wrong, but in practice it made the game feel punishing rather than empowering. The level design themselves had standard platforming with environmental hazards and enemy encounters. There were a range of different stages, from forests, industrial complexes and mutated landscapes, everything you think you're going to see after a nuke is hit. Some areas require precise jumping and wall climbing, while others throw waves at enemies at you just for fun. Boss battles punctuate the end of certain stages, featuring large mutant creatures that often require memorization and patience to defeat. The combat feels really great as a werewolf, but as a human, battles are just, crap. It means you're taking damage at the wrong time can leave you in nearly unwinnable situations. Like, imagine that, you're nearly about to win and bang, you get hit and you're a human again. It's like, well, I can't do this very now. Well, I can, but it's just going to be an arse. Visually, Werewolf: The Last Warrior was one of the most striking NES games for its time. The character sprites were really good, and the werewolf in particular standing out as the muscular, intimidating figure, like me looking at a mirror in my dreams. The backgrounds were also dark and atmospheric, helping sell that apocalyptic setting. The game's comic book style also added the flair, presenting story beats with bold illustrations that felt more stylish than simple text screens common in those days. Unfortunately, the game's difficulty in what most players remember. Enemy placement is often cheap, requiring near-perfect reflexes, and the limited range of Ken's human attacks make early encounters punishing. Knockback from hits frequently send players into pits, and health recovery items are scarce, just like Castlevania. While NES games were often designed to be tough, Werewolf: The Last Warrior crossed into the territory of feeling unfair at times, frustrating casual players and limiting its broader appeal. And this meant reception was kind of divided. Some praised that unique concept of being able to transform into a werewolf, but some just didn't like the mechanics and the human side. It never really became a household name like Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden, both of which offered those dark themes and more refined gameplay. Instead, it just had to settle as being an obscure game as one of Data East's most experimental but flawed releases. Today, Werewolf: The Last Warrior is remembered mostly as a curiosity than anything. Like a werewolf superhero fighting mutants in a ruined world sounds really cool, but the execution just wasn't there. However, for those who like a challenge like in Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden, this might be right up your alley. And finally, Destiny of an Emperor. By the late 80s and early 90s, the NES library was starting to expand a bit, beyond platformers and action titles. Role-playing games were starting to find their footing in the West, I say starting, with Final Fantasy and Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest, introducing console games to Japanese RPG traditions. Among these releases was Destiny of an Emperor, a Capcom-developed title released in North America in 1990. Based on the Chinese historical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it stood out as one of the few NES RPGs to draw heavily from real-world history and literature. Combining strategy elements, unique combat mechanics, and a sprawling storyline, Destiny of an Emperor remains one of the most distinctive RPGs on the system. Players control Liu Bei, a warlord who rises to power with the help of his sworn brothers, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei. I probably butchered all three of them. From there, the player recruits officers, raises armies, and battles rival warlords such as Cao Cao, Cao Cao, C-A-O, I'm pronouncing that as Cao Cao, in a request to unify the land. Unlike many fantasy RPGs at the time, the game grounds itself in real characters and events, weaving historical figures and locations into its narrative, like Yasuke in Assassin's Creed Shadows. This gave it a sense of scope and authenticity uncommon for NES games, while still allowing for dramatisation and RPG-style embellishments. Now, gameplay in Destiny of an Emperor is a hybrid of traditional RPG exploration and large-scale strategy. Players move from town to town across an overworld map, visiting villages and talking to citizens and purchasing supplies. However, instead of fighting random monsters, battles are waged against enemy armies. Each battle pits the player's generals against opposing warlords, with thousands of soldiers represented by numerical values rather than individual sprites. A general's soldier count functions as both their health and strength, meaning the more soldiers they command, the more damage they can deal and absorb. This system was an inventive twist on the standard hit points mechanic used in other RPGs. Recruitment was also another feature. Now, after defeating the enemy's generals, players often had the opportunity to persuade them to join their side. Well, it's either that or I'm going to kill you. The mechanic gave the game a sense of growth and variety, as your army could expand with dozens of historical officers, each with different levels of strength, loyalty, and abilities. Managing your roster of generals became a strategic element in itself, as players had to choose who to field in battle, who to keep in reserve, and how to balance power across the party. The combat itself mixed RPG simplicity with strategic depth. Battles were turn-based, but instead of just attacking, generals could use special tactics, heal their troops, or execute strategies like ambushes. These options provided more depth than typical attack magic item formula of other RPGs at the time. Since soldiers represented both health and offensive strength, deciding when to heal or when to press the attack was crucial, giving battles a tactical edge. Graphically, Destiny of Emperor was functional rather than flashy. The overworld and towns used simple tile graphics typical of the NES RPG genre, but the character portraits of generals and large battle screens gave the game personality. The game's biggest challenge was its difficulty curve. Recruiting the right generals and properly managing resources was essential, and players unfamiliar with the strategy elements could easily find themselves overwhelmed. Grinding for supplies and soldiers was also necessary, as stronger armies demanded better preparation. This made Destiny of an Emperor less accessible than some of its peers, but for dedicated players who wanted to give it the time, it offered a unique, rewarding experience. Reception at the time was kinda modest. Many NES owners were unfamiliar with the Romance of the Three Kingdoms source material. But of course they were! We learn about World War I and World War II in castles and stuff. We don't learn about Chinese history. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Chinese history. We just don't learn it. Come on, I learned about castles and shit like that when I was growing up. Like 1066 and then World War I, World War II, Vietnam, that's what I learnt in school. Either way, the game's slower pace and strategic systems weren't as immediately appealing as action-heavy titles. There are still people who enjoy this game, and it has been recognised as one of the most innovative titles on the system. Today, however, it's often remembered as a bit of a cult classic. It's a mix of history, RPG progression, and strategy set it apart from other games, and its recruitment mechanic foreshadowed features that would later become staples in games like Fire Emblem and Suikoden. While it never achieved the same fame as Final Fantasy, it did remain a fascinating experiment that showed just how diverse RPGs on the NES could be. And that's it! 7 completely unnamed games, although yes, there is one I know, that I really never played and really I think are unknown gems. Let me know what you think of this list. Have I got this right? Are the ones I need to talk about in future videos? Until then, I'll see everyone again in 3 days for another video. My name's been Danny. Chase your dreams.